Hello and welcome to Unacademy, the one-stop solution for an English medium UPSC Civil Services aspirant. Today, as part of your comprehensive news analysis, we'll be discussing 7 very interesting articles out of the Hindu newspaper, and there are 4 to 5 very critical articles from the mains examination. But before we begin, let us look at 3 to 4 very important announcements for you. Firstly, this offer is going to end on 25th. So if you want to become a part of the Unacademy family, a 15-month course is available at 29,999, and this offer will end on 25th, and I hope you will use it to become a part of the Unacademy family generally. Thereafter, we have a very important live workshop which is scheduled for 26th of May at 11 a.m. and Sarmad Sir himself is going to take this session, and he's going to talk about how you can choose IAS and IPS as a very good career option after your 12th class in your first year itself. Thereafter, as part of Conquer Prelims, today we have the 7th session of Hima Bindu ma'am with regards to science and technology on the app itself. So I hope you have been part of the first 6. She's discussing static questions and static concepts via questions through these sessions on the app. Further, Mukesh sir will be back today with again places in news, and he'll be discussing at 7:30 on the YouTube channel which you are right now watching, and he'll be talking about places in news, all the current affairs about it, and the session link is given in the description box. And if you want the PPT for this or any other session before this, it is on Telegram. So you can join our Telegram channel. Again, the link is given in the description box, and you can join easily and get the PDF for all these sessions. So I hope you will use these sessions constructively for your preparation. With this, let's look at the topics we are going to cover. First is a bilateral matter, but a bilateral bromance which has recently developed with regards to Russia and China. Thereafter, we'll talk about Hyderabad, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. On June 2nd, there will be a major change. Hyderabad will cease to be the capital of Andhra Pradesh, only Telangana, and there are multiple implications for that, and this is a very explosive situation which is going to develop within the next 15 to 20 days. Thereafter, we'll talk about, and this is a FAQ, the text and context section. This is a very interesting article about certain concerns, and the Supreme Court is hearing this. This is sub judice with regards to Association for Democratic Reform, talking about a lot of things which are not being done rightly by the Election Commission of India. Last but not the least is the concept of loss and damage fund, and the attribution of local weathers towards what we call as climate change. Then we have 2 very standard concepts, which is one the Booker Prize, and then we'll talk about our Vice President in Tehran. So we have 6 to 7 important topics, but if you go into the concept itself, 4 to 5 major concepts you have to understand for the mains examination, 2 simple concepts for the prelims examination itself. So with this, let's enter the first article, which is the concept of Russia-China relationship. Now, the article has been written by a former Indian ambassador, and he has very well chalked out the relationship between Russia and China, and this gives us our opportunity to revise our world history and also have a phase-by-phase understanding of what he's arguing are certain concerns and opportunity for India in this larger change in geopolitical space which had happened or which has happened after 2012 itself. So let's talk about how he divides the whole context of this major meeting which happened between Putin and Xi Jinping, and this is celebrating 75 years of the relationship between which is People's Republic of China PCR and Putin and Russia, and there is a lot to unpack here which we'll do systematically. So the first thing which he does is he divides the relationship into 5 phases. This could be critical for you to write a very good answer for international relations or world history. So let's try to understand how does he divide this relationship into 5 parts and what are the dynamics within it. So when we talk about phase 1, the phase 1 of this relationship was during the Tsarist period. Now for the students who do not know what Tsarist means, Tsar is a title which is taken by the king of the Russian Empire. Tsar written like this also, C-Z-A-R, Tsarist period. And the Tsarist period is when the Russian Empire was at its peak, and during this period China was not as powerful as it was or is today, it is weak, and Russia was expanding, or the Russian Empire was expanding in the Far East at the cost of China. We already know, or you would have studied this in world history, the concept of the Russo-Japanese War over Manchuria, and generally Russia was expanding in the Pacific sector. Certain islands were also taken via the Chinese cost or at the expense of China itself. This is a period where we can say that China is exponentially weak to the Russian Empire, to the Tsar, and therefore here China could not do anything. And this is the ebbs and flows of this relationship, which has gone through certain sectors and through certain concepts itself. Moving out of this, he then points out that phase 2 is when we go into the communist phase, wherein after the Russian Revolution since 1917, we have the Russian, what we call a socialist party, Lenin, and over and above that the civil war which is happening in Russia, that will in turn lead to the development of, by 1924-25, the USSR. And at the same point of time, Mao is going to be expanding his idea of communism within China itself, which is Maoism itself, which is a modification of the communist ideology, adding the peasant along with the worker vis-a-vis the communist revolution, vis-a-vis the workers' revolution. And USSR and the People's Republic of China, USSR and the People's Republic of China, which is 1949, after the Chinese Revolution, the conflict between the KMT and the CCP, or the Communist Party of China. This will in turn lead to finally the KMT going to Taiwan, which is the context for the Taiwanese and Chinese friction relationship itself. And we have USSR and the People's Republic of China relationship, which develops and becomes very solidified. The common goal and the common thread here is socialism. Though we cannot say that USSR is properly socialist, we can actually never say that China is actually socialist. Though they call themselves the People's Republic of China or the Communist Party of China, they don't even have 1 ounce or thread of communism or socialism today in them. And that too, be it Lenin, be it Stalin, or be it Mao, they just used socialism to come to power, and thereafter they diluted the concept of socialism generally. So this is where socialism, communism, this basic bromance, as the word is used by the article itself, this basic relationship develops into a very solid block. The whole concept of the Eastern Bloc relationship after the Second World War, the development of the Cold War politics itself, the Eastern Bloc, USSR and China played a very pivotal role in creating a certain power space which could challenge the West or capitalism. Now here we can say that they may be not fully equal partners, but China under Mao is rising, and the People's Republic of China at this point of time is considered powerful enough, but this relationship is extremely important to balance the West, to balance the Western Bloc, to balance America. However, again, if you've done your world history, you would know that this relationship is going to go through a little bit of conflict, and that conflict phase is in the 1960s and will peak in 1969 with regards to a territorial dispute which they will have, which is called the Ussuri River dispute. In the Ussuri River dispute, which is basically a border dispute, they will actually fight a small war, not at the scale of any other war which was happening at this point of time in the world, but there were tensions and there were small skirmishes which were happening near the Ussuri River, which in turn sours the relationship. Over and above that, this is the period in which America has taken off and USSR is now showing its what we call as age, and over and above that the Eastern Bloc is becoming more and more problematic. Poland, Czechoslovakia, that whole satellite state sector is becoming more and more problematic to hold, and USSR was using force to hold on to these satellite states, from Hungary to Czechoslovakia to Poland, Poland being the hotspot for that. And China could see that Russia has a very, very strong, very hard line concept and what we call as way of taking these back into the communist bloc. And therefore here China gets a realization that as it is being in the communist bloc, it is not getting a lot of trade and there is economic blockade all around. USA is the world of opportunity, the land of opportunity with a lot of consumerism happening there. China was having a very big population, cheap labor, and the realization here starts to come in that we are not gaining anything from this relationship generally. And that is why we go into the fourth phase, which is very well known in 1970s as the concept of détente. Again, if you know your world history, you would know what is détente. Détente is the period of thaw, which is the escalations are going down with the nuclear power becoming more and more problematic. Everybody realizing that in a nuclear war there is no winner, everybody is a loser, and over and above that, now nuclear power itself, the most destructive bomb, is going to become the biggest deterrent in the world itself. Now in the détente period, as it is, USSR economy is now crumbling from within. The over-exploitation of the satellite states itself is not giving it generally anything. And in the détente 1970s period, what is going to happen is China is going to pivot. That pivot will happen because the West is also going to pivot. There's a pivot where China wanted to produce for the world and wanted to become the factory of the world, and at the same point of time the West wanted an alternative. After being engaged for a very long time in the Vietnam War itself, the war against communism needed a better solution, and that better solution was to either go with China, destabilize that relationship. So at the same point of time, when China wanted to pivot towards the West and the West wanted a better solution for communism and USA wanted a better way of tackling communism, they will now go into a relationship, and this is where the coziness between the People's Republic of China and the USA will develop. And herein, Chiang Kai-shek, KMT will be thrown away by the Americans. Taiwan, in a way, though, will remain in the larger concept of one China and the concept of this dualistic relationship which they will develop. But now the Americans will start to not recognize the KMT, which is the ROC Republic of China, but the KMT, the PRC, which is Mao's China, as the real China. And therefore here we see that China becomes pro-West. And we can argue at the same point of time USSR will disintegrate in 1991, 1992. In this point, China's relationship with Russia is the worst. Wherein this is the low point where China does not want anything to do with Russia, and USSR has now become Russia itself. Russia is coming out of the what we call as satellite states, the republics coming out of the USSR itself, and Russia is very, very weak, and China generally, as of right now, is happy to produce for the world, and this is where Made in China concept comes in. Till this point, the author argues, and till 2012, he gives it the cutoff date, not me, but the author is arguing 2012 is the cutoff date. Till 2012, China wanted to distance itself from Russia and just had basic diplomatic relationship. It's not that they did not have a diplomatic relationship, basic diplomatic relationship was there. Now he argues that this phase, which is our fifth phase, which is since 2012, is where things have become extremely interesting. What he argues is that in 2012 there was the US Pivot Asia strategy, which is that the US became more and more interested in the politics of the Indo-Pacific itself, and now China will see the US as an adversary, and there will be the rivalry between the US and the Chinese over the South China Sea, over the security complex of this whole sector itself, and the China-US relationship will now fall out. And at the same point of time, now China and Russia will go into a relationship of anti-West and anti-US. But in this relationship or in this phase, China is much more stronger than Russia, with an economy 3 times bigger, with the GDP of Russia being 1/7 of what it was for China, and Russia looking for more and more avenues of investment. And in 2014, Russia, we know, will annex the Crimean Peninsula. That will in turn lead to more economic sanctions. And since the Ukrainian war itself, the more the Americans wanted to and NATO wanted to encircle Russia, the more they've pushed Russia towards China. And therefore, since 2022, the relationship has been at the highest point, but we can't say that China and Russia, the relationship is equal. We can't say that. We would rather say that here, the power of the Chinese in this relationship is much higher than the Russians. Though the Russians have the technology, Chinese have the funding. As it is, China is following a new imperialistic policy across Africa, across Asia, specifically in Pakistan, where it's just giving as much money or money which is exponentially more than what they could repay back, in turn leading to debt capitalism, or what we call as debt imperialism in that sense. So China and Russia relationship is at the coziest at this point of time, but China, according to the author, is at a much higher position, and further the anti-West and anti-US stance which has been taken now creates challenges for both the world and for India. And this is where the article becomes relevant for your international relations. So there are 5 phases which have been talked about, from Tsarist period to the communist phase to the conflict phase, and the lowest point in that regard coming in the détente period in 1970s of the Cold War politics itself. And then after 2012, this relationship has changed and become a more cozy relationship, but with China having an upper edge over Russia. Now, what is the implication of this? What is the implication of this? This is more relevant for you for the examination. You can use this 5-phase division to write a good answer also, but you cannot write too much. One line about each of these phases would be good enough to summarize this relationship. Now, when we talk about implications, first thing is the joint statement which has been given recently. When the joint statement was given, strategically, fiscal, economic, military, aid and relationship were not talked about. Very strategically, in the whole of the joint statement, there is nothing about the money, the economic ties, the trade, import, export, or the military assistance which China is giving to Russia. There was no talk about it. This was to make sure that there's no Western criticism. They just wanted to be silent on this. This is strategic silence. However, the joint statement which was given recently is extremely anti-US, and in a way, as a corollary, it is also anti-NATO, which is that it is saying that the NATO and specifically the US are meddling into the politics of Asia, which is unconstructive, which is distasteful, and therefore the US needs to stay away from the internal politics and the dynamisms of this whole continent. And therefore the idea is very simple. It's a joint call out to the US being the problem of the East. To some level, if you go by how the US destabilized Afghanistan, how they destabilized Syria, the whole concept of Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, or we talk about ISIS, the US is a very important destabilizing agent in this sector. But this is a different type of destabilization they're talking about, wherein they're saying that this old bloc which has re-emerged, which is Russia and China, it is anti-US, and US, it's uncalled for meddling into the Indo-Pacific is something which they don't like. This is the implication for the world as of right now, that the two old buddies or bros are back creating a bromance, and that is the word which is used in the article itself very aptly in that sense. And therefore Russia and China coming together is now going to create, in the current geopolitical context, a lot of interesting repercussions. Now, whilst this is one thing where there is a alliance which is back, what is the implication for India? Here he talks about for India there are two things. There can be a challenge and there can also be an opportunity. Now, with regards to challenge, it is very clear that Russia is one of the biggest defense partners for India, and when it comes to defense technology and partnership, there could be Chinese pressure on the Russians at this point of time to stop defense cooperation or destabilize it, or there can also be that the Chinese are trying to push their own technology into the Russian sector and they don't want India to have that technology. Though we are not asking for it, but the basic point is there is a lot of Chinese pressure which can be created on Putin to remove the very all-weather relationship between India and Russia and create a little bit of tension there. So here India needs to mitigate this, and this can only be mitigated when there is a good and very transparent, clear communication between India and Russia, and therefore we have to mitigate this because this is critical. With regards to tanks, with regards to fighter jets, we are extremely dependent and we have multiple joint projects which are running from nuclear power plants. Russia is a very important partner for us when it comes to nuclear technology, when it comes to defense, and when it comes to how we emerge as a much greater power in a military sense. Now, the opportunity here, according to him, is that India can now have a more clear stance, a more nuanced approach, and India can now very simply quote to the Russians. For with regards to Russia, we have had to, in a way, steer clear of how the world perceived that relationship. So there can be more clarity in that stance, and we can also use this coziness of Russia and China to make our relationship with the USA better. So there's an opportunity to leverage this as a better relationship with the USA, and over and above that we can use it as a nuanced approach towards how we give the right message to China, right message to Russia, right message to the US. So therefore, it is an opportunity and a challenge at the same point of time. So before I move on to the next article, there are two things which you should remember from this. This is a short summary I'm trying to give you here before we move on. Firstly, you should remember the 5 phases which have been talked about with regards to Tsarist Russia, then the relationship vis-a-vis the communist or the Comintern relationship in that regard. Then the third is the conflict phase, the Ussuri River 1969 conflict, then the détente phase, and then from 2012 onwards, a phase in which Russia and China have come together with their common enemy, which is the US. And US pivot Asia has been the trigger for that in that sense. The second thing which you should know at the same point of time, you should know is the concept of what is the implication for the world, what is the implication for India. Implication wise, for India, it is very simply a challenge and an opportunity. We have to make sure that we don't alienate Russia too much. At the same point of time, leverage this as a relationship builder with the USA itself. So we have to make sure clear-cut messaging with the Russians, and it's an opportunity, as I told you, because it can lead to a better relationship with the USA and better stance and clarity in this relationship generally. For the world, as of right now, there is again an anti-West, anti-US, and anti-NATO bloc which is emerging very, very quickly. This reminds us of what we today call as Cold War 2.0, which is now Cold War politics. The Iron Curtain is back, and therefore this is very, very important that what Churchill had argued previously, the Iron Curtain is back, and the geopolitical dimensions in the European sector as of right now are in a way giving us a deja vu moment with regards to Cold War politics. With this, let's move to the next article, which is about Hyderabad, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Here again, this has been in making for the past 10 years, but there are multiple implications for what we have to understand here. So on June 2nd, what is going to happen is that Hyderabad according to the Reorganization Act itself, Hyderabad will cease to be the capital of both Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, and it will only be the capital of Telangana. Now, with Telangana getting Hyderabad, there are multiple implications for this, and there are much more systemic concepts which automatically come in and allow us to revise something which you don't really know. So here we know that under the State Reorganization Act of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, after June 2nd, Telangana will get Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh has to shift to its new capital, which is Amravati. Now, as of right now, the MPs of Andhra Pradesh all live in Hyderabad, and there are multiple institutions and buildings which are being held by the Andhra Pradesh government. Though the secretariat was transferred in a truce brokered by the MHA, which is Ministry of Home Affairs, the problem is the houses, the offices are the first issue. Here, it's a very simple, straightforward solution, as the article says, which is that houses and offices, the Andhra Pradesh government would then have to pay exponentially higher rents, and that rent will be paid off to the Telangana government. That is a very simple, straightforward concept. There is no big issue here. There will be a transitionary phase. The transition should have happened, but the problem is that the transition still has not happened. So there will be a transfer of rent amount from Andhra Pradesh government to Telangana. But what is more problematic is there are 3 to 4 stalemate moments, 3 to 4 points where there is no form of consensus. And the first which is talked about is a very interesting thing, which is called Schedule 9 and 10 institutions. Now, these are more systemic issues and are not just related to Hyderabad, but to the whole bifurcation itself. What are these Schedule 9 and 10 institutions? They are called public sector corporations, also called as assets, public sector corporations of the Andhra Pradesh government. The question is, how do they get divided? Because they also need to be divided amongst Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, and therefore the question is, how do you divide this? And there has been no agreement over this. The MHA was called upon for arbitration for this also, but the MHA said that there needs to be a mutual agreement and we have to make sure that we do not force anybody, but again, there can be a unilateral decision which can be taken by either. So the first issue is, how do you divide the public sector corporations which the Andhra Pradesh government used to hold for both and now need to get divided? How do you divide it is equally important. How do you divide it is equally important. The second thing which is equally important for us is debt. The debt of the state, which is the Andhra Pradesh state and the Telangana state have to now divide the debt of the erstwhile unified Andhra Pradesh. And therefore, there has been no agreement over this, that how would they divide the debt of these two states itself, or the cumulative debt. What is the percentage of bifurcation has not been talked about in that sense. Further, there is also one more thing, which is staff. Here, when we talk about staff, this means all forms of officials and staff. There is again no agreement over how there will be staff bifurcation, how there will be debt, which is much more systemic and problematic, and Schedule 9 and 10 assets and institutions or the public sector corporations of the Andhra Pradesh government. Now, there is a very interesting aspect which has been talked about in the article, which is that why is the central government getting involved? And the reason for that is Section 93 of State States Reorganization Act, the States Reorganization Act, the States Reorganization Act, and under the States Reorganization Act of 1956 and section 93 of that, the center is mandated to develop and sustain a successor state. Successor state means that if two states are bifurcated, in the example of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, for example, you have Chhattisgarh and MP, for example, Bihar and Jharkhand, Jharkhand being the successor, Chhattisgarh being the successor, Uttarakhand being the successor, here Telangana being the successor. Here, the center is mandated to develop and sustain the successor state within 10 years. Meaning, any form of assistance which is needed should be done within 10 years, maximum the 11th year. And the center has promised to Telangana a lot of things under this concept, wherein an IIM, financial support, and over and above that also a central tribal university. Central tribal university is something which has been promised by the center to Telangana, and now both these states are saying that you look at the indifferent attitude of the center, that they do not want to do arbitration, and it has been 10 years, but still there has been no development with regards to these things or even sustaining the successor state and the disputes. So what they're doing is at the same point of time, they are fighting with each other on these three concepts, but they're also criticizing the center at the same point of time, saying that under section 93, you should have done all of this within 10 years. You're not doing anything, you're not helping us. So this is a developing story. This is a developing story, and we need to see what are the solutions which come through. But for the examination, it gives us 4 to 5 very interesting concepts. First, again, trying to give you a very short summary so that you can understand it, and we'll move on to the third article. A very simple, straightforward concept is you have to know what do you mean by Schedule 9 and 10 assets. This can be quoted in the examination anywhere, saying that what are the Schedule 9 and 10 assets under what we call as states itself, and herein we have the concept of public sector. With the concept of public sector, corporations are one of the most important and hot topics right now between these two states itself. And further, there can be also discussion with regards to section 93, which has now come into vogue and into context because of this article itself, and the mandate of the center to sustain and develop a state within 10 years itself. And further, this gives you a lot of fodder, it gives you a lot of material to write about our smaller states, or is reorganization an answer to the issues which we face vis-a-vis regionalism. And within India, there are multiple calls for state reorganization still under different principles itself. And this question has previously come in the mains examination, that are smaller states better? What is the burden of smaller states on what we call today as the center or the consolidated funds or the public exchequer? And over and above that, there's also a lot of conversation with regards to should we further reorganize. So this can be used as a point which tells you that reorganizing the state is the easier part. Making its boundary may be the little bit harder part, but the hardest and the most problematic is this form of asset distribution, and what is the central mandate and what are the aspirations of the states itself. Here there's a rivalry and there are aspirations on both sides which needs to be balanced. 10 years was a good enough timeline for transfer of capital itself, that still is not in the right space itself, and in the coming next 1 month, we will be discussing this topic multiple times again, because this is a very relevant portion for you, and generally there has to be and there will be a lot of back and forth between these states generally. And with the CM, A.R. Reddy has already argued that on 2nd, the Secretariat and the basic buildings which are being held by the Andhra Pradesh government should be taken over by Telangana. Now there is already a recipe for confrontation ready. With this, let's move to the next article, and this is a very, very interesting one, which is that there has been a lot of talk about voter percentage, delay in release of percentage of voters or percentage of voting, and now the Supreme Court is also involved. Now, in order to understand this article, there's a lot of backstory which you should know, and I'll try to give you that static understanding so that you are able to understand what is the argument which has been put forward by the Association of Democratic Reform, which has taken the Election Commission of India to the Supreme Court. Now, under the conduct of election rules 1961, this is basically used as an act to create the rules and regulations for the day-to-day, what we call as organization, and more than that, how the basic conduct of the election happens on that day itself. Now, under the conduct of election rules 1961, there is a mandate. The mandate is, see, the polling stations will open, people will come and vote, and by 6 or 7 in the evening, the polling stations will be closed. Within the polling station, we have the presiding officer, the returning officer, and we also have what are called as polling agents. All political parties have a right to send a polling agent inside the polling station, and very simply they observe everything which is happening to have transparency in the election process. Now, under 49S2, under the rules and regulations 49S2, there's a very important mandate which the returning officer has to do. The returning officer has to maintain 2 forms, 17A and 17C. These are 2 forms which are in the news day and night, and you should know what do you mean by 17A and 17C. Under the form 17A, the details of all the voters who have voted is noted. This is irrelevant to the polling agents, to the polling parties, which is, you would have seen those small rectangular boxes which is there, and they cut that has your date of birth, that has your address, that basically is captured within form 17A. This is irrelevant to the story because there's no controversy over form 17A. Form 17C is very interesting because form 17C has 2 parts. Part 1 and part 2. Now let's try to understand what is the difference between part 1 and part 2. Under form 17C, part 1, there is a lot of data which is furnished by the returning officer, which is, it tells you the number of EVMs in that polling station. Further, it also tells you, with regards to number of EVMs, how many people entered but did not vote, how many people entered were not allowed to vote, how many people entered and voted, and basically the total number of votes cast in that specific polling booth, along with total number of votes per EVM is also furnished in that Form C Part 1. Now, these two are very important data because this is basically your percentage of voter turnout and nothing but the absolute count of voters who voted that day, and per EVM how many votes were taken tells you within that same polling station the A, B, C, D, which is subdivisions in the different sectors in the constituency, that is also told. Now part 2 is not used on the day of polling, but is actually used on the day of counting. On the counting day, these two numbers are cross-checked when the EVM is opened and it starts to count. Then as per an ideal situation, the total number of votes per EVM should be exactly equal, and the total number of votes which were cast and the total number of votes which were counted should also be equal. Now, on the day of the polling, this is basically Form C Part 1 and Part 2. Part 2 is not of any purpose to us. It is on the counting day. Now, on the day when the polling shuts, it is 6 or 7 o'clock, every voter has voted. It is mandated under 49S2 that Form C Part 1 photocopy should be given to each and every polling station, polling agent of every political party. So whatever polling station it is, within that, whoever is present as a polling agent of the political party, he should be given Form 17C Part 1. Basically, it is these polling agents along with the candidate who go on the counting day and check the corresponding number. Is there equal count of EVM numbers, EVM votes, and over and above that, votes cast itself. Now, there is a lot of controversy over this issue with regards to Form 17C Part 1 and the numbers which are being quoted here. So this part of this discussion was basically to give you the context. The context is very simple, which is under the conduct of election rules 1961, 49S2, there are two forms which are generated on the day of voting, Form 17A and 17C, 17C Part 1, and under Form 17C Part 1, there are two parts, Part 1 and Part 2. Here, number of EVMs, total number of votes cast, and total number of votes per EVM are taken into consideration and are noted. This is given to every polling agent who goes and gives it to its candidate. And on the day of counting, these two numbers, these three numbers are correspondingly checked by the political parties. This is called electoral transparency. You try to create as transparent a concept, and the percentage of voter turnout and absolute count of voter numbers are very, very important. So this is the context. Now, what is the controversy? Now, the controversy is over, there are three accusations which the association of democratic reform, an NGO, has argued, and it has taken the Election Commission of India to the Supreme Court over these three accusations. The first one is very simple, that it is saying there are delays in the data of final voter count after polling in every phase. So, for example, the initial voter count is mostly counted till 5 o'clock, and still people are voting and are in the queue. So the final voter count mostly is released, previously used to release or was released within 48 hours. However, in phase 1, the delay was 11 days, and in phase 2, it took the election commission 4 days, which is actually suspiciously very, very long, very, very long. A very long delay in releasing the final voter count numbers. Second accusation, very simple, is related to this itself, which is that the Election Commission of India is not releasing absolute voter numbers, which is how many lakhs, how many crores. Rather, they are releasing percentage of voting. Now, this percentage of voting is not the right parameter to check if there has been an increase in voting or there has been a decrease in voting. Absolute number of voters is a more important parameter that basically tells you if more people actually emerged or came in or not. And as much as there would be not a lot of differentiation, there is a lot of hue and cry over not releasing the exact voter number on the website. And more than that, there are two more things which the ADR is pointing out, which is Association for Democratic Reform. The argument is the third and the fourth is even more grave, which is there is a major discrepancy, major anomaly in the initial and the final voting numbers, which is that, for example, in phase 1, when the data was released initially, it said 60% voting turnout. But when the final data was released after 11 days, it said close to 66%, an increase of 5%. And the same was true for phase 2, wherein there was again a 5% increase in the initial and the final voting count. This is problematic because there should be no major differentiation, because by 5 o'clock most of the voters should have been voted. It can't be that 5% of the voters, which would be a very big number, were waiting between 5 to 7 to cast their vote or were in queue. So ADR is saying that, and the opposition is saying, and multiple forms of criticism are coming through for the Election Commission, that how can you have previously 1%, 2%, 0.5%, 1.5% was considered a good deviation. But this deviation is very, very big, which is the concept of 5% deviation between initial and final numbers. So the delta here, the deviation, is so high that it doesn't make sense that 5% of the voters would only vote in 2 hours, and how can the polling stations accommodate 5% of the voters in this what initial, final, mostly the last 1.5 hours of voting itself. And now there is again a lot of questions have already come in with regards to electoral fraud, electoral transparency has been now questioned. So now people are saying, where have these 5% come from? And the plea which is pushed to the Supreme Court is that the Election Commission of India should release the absolute number of voters data per polling station within 48 hours, and a differentiation between initial and final is also that initial is mostly a vague number. It has been given for the whole constituency. In the final numbers, you also get further breakdown in within that same constituency per polling station what was the number. And the plea in front of the Supreme Court is that 48 hours is a good time, 2 days is a good time for the Election Commission to put this on the website. So, first we discussed the idea behind this. Second, we have now discussed what are the issues pointed out. First issue pointed out, delays in data release, and that too major delays. Second, absolute voter data has not been released, rather only percentage of voting. And second, there is a very big delta in deviation between initial and final. And over and above that, the plea is that the Election Commission of India should release the absolute number within 48 hours. Not a very big plea, not a very out of the box or a very revolutionary plea. It's a very simple plea. Now, how has the Supreme Court taken this? How has the Election Commission taken this? And it's a sub judice issue, so we don't know what is going to happen with regards to that. Now, when we talk about what this Election Commission has argued, Election Commission has been a little bit inconsiderate and has given a very absolute statement. And the absolute statement it has argued is that it has no legal obligation. There's no legal obligation. This is continued from the discussion we were having previously. And it is said it has no legal obligation for releasing or to release the absolute voter number on the website. They are saying that Form 617C is generated. Form 17C photocopies have been given to polling stations, are being given out at polling stations rather, and at the same point of time, the polling agents are getting it, and therefore the candidates know the number. So their argument is that the people who should be concerned know it, which is the candidates know it because they have been given 17C. 17C, there is no delay in giving. Now, this is a problematic aspect. If you have the number, if you have the data, and that is collated within 2 days, what is the problem in releasing the absolute number and holding on to the absolute number and only giving us percentages? This is basically what the Supreme Court has also said, or rather the Supreme Court is saying. The Supreme Court is saying, why not? Why can you not release the absolute voting numbers if you already have it? When you already have 17C, that will get collated and been sent to the Election Commission of India. And if you can show it to the candidates, you can show it to the people also. So the initial hearing, the CGI himself has argued, what is your apprehension? Why not? The Election Commission of India is arguing that the 17C final data or the final voter count includes postal ballot data also. So that would in turn lead to a certain deviation, which technically is not taking into account the 5% which we are talking about, and therefore it would be misleading. So then the Supreme Court is arguing that again release these data in a segregated manner. Now this was the initial hearing. We don't know what is going to happen. The next hearing is very soon. The argument is that Election Commission, by using this word no legal obligation, is arguing that it is not mandated under the Conduct of Election Rules of 1961 that we release the data to the people. When there is no obligation, then why should we? Now, in the end, the biggest issue which emerges is that even this argument does not really stand. I'll tell you why. And what the article again points out, very, very well written article that was. It says that, okay, candidates are getting to know. Let's take an example for one constituency, and if every constituency has 2,000 to 2,200 booths which are voting, this means that there are close to 2,000 to 2,217 C forms which are generated. And over and above that, the polling agents, not every candidate can actually afford. There has to be close to three such polling agents minimum to manage that whole polling station, which means 6,000 people or agents are needed by one candidate for one constituency to monitor this number and collate this number. Now, what the Association of Democratic Reform is saying, this is a very, very big number. If I'm an independent candidate, what if I'm not a very big political party? I'm not the BJPs and the Congress of India. I don't have 6,000 people. And if I'm contesting on multiple seats in multiple phases, where do I get 6,000 people from every time? There's a cost for that. Now, as an independent candidate, I rely not on 17C, but on the absolute number which is given by the Election Commission and the poll-wise or the phase-wise polling station-wise data. Now, if you can't give us that, how do you expect everybody to know? Yes, the major candidates know. Yes, the major candidates know, but the smaller candidates don't know. And there's a very interesting point which basically is being argued here, which is that vis-a-vis Election Commission saying no illegal obligation, when there can be electoral transparency, then why are we holding back? So I'll end this topic again by giving you 3 to 4 facts which you should remember. First is Conduct of Election Rules 1961. Then you should know 49S2. Then you need to know 17A and C difference. 17C is part 1, deals with EVMs, total number of votes cast in that EVM. Further, the total number of votes in that polling station itself. What are the accusations being made? Too much delay, absolute data is not being provided, too much deviation between initial and final. Further, Election Commission has taken a hard line wherein they're saying no legal obligation to give it, but the Supreme Court most probably is going to make the Election Commission release this data. Looking at the arguments which are happening as of right now, we don't know, I don't know. The point is that if you can have the best possible transparency in an election where already the Election Commission of India has been accused of a lot of things, these type of statements don't look good. That is the only point the article is trying to make. And the logistics of somebody getting this data as an independent candidate at a small political party is already too big a cost for an independent small political party. So this is basically the argument made out in the text and context article. And we can now move on to the last major article we have to discuss, which is attribution of extreme events to climate change. Now again, let's try to understand what is the conversation behind this and what is the argument here. Now see, under the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the IPCC has been put under pressure, and within the UNFCCC there has been a lot of talk about something called loss and damage due to climate change and climate change related extreme weather events. And therefore, there's also another argument that this is called L&D. With regards to L&D, there's an argument that there needs to be an L&D fund. L&D fund for the least developed countries, the LDCs. For the LDCs, there needs to be a L&D fund, loss and damages fund. For example, in the past 10 to 15 years, and in the future, these Polynesian islands or these smaller states itself, least developed countries, for example, in Africa, they all will get affected by climate change. And maybe the US has the capacity to fight off 5 different hurricanes and rebuild every time. Those countries don't have the capacity to do that. And therefore, international funding, international assistance is critical under the L&D fund. Now, this is based on vulnerability. India is also vulnerable to the cost of climate change, and there's a lot of chatter, lot of discussion about the fiscal consequences, or today what we call as the financial cost of climate change. Which is that previously people used to talk only about the concept of human cost. Now there is human cost, but there's a fiscal cost also. There's a financial cost also, which is that if a drought happens, there's a certain economic impact for that. If there's a hurricane or a typhoon or a cyclone, there's an economic cost for the damages which have happened. And therefore, very simply, the UNFCCC and all the discussion which is happening within it is about how can we attribute climate change and local events. And this is a very important point. See, if I have to compensate you for something, first, it should be very clear that I am responsible for the act which has happened to you or what has happened to you, then only I will compensate you, right? For example, you had a car, you took it to the garage, I made certain changes, everything was sorted, everything was perfect. But from an authorized dealer like me, you took the car to a smaller dealer, he did a little bit of electrical changes, and when you were driving on the highway, your car catches fire. Now, what you do is, you come to me and say, you are responsible, this loss should be attributed to you because you are the one who has led to this loss and damage which has happened to me. Now, I would say that I would want to analyze the car and see if you can attribute this damage to me, because if I am responsible and I am accountable, I will give that, but I want to check. When I check the cars, I find that the root cause was electrical change. There was no electrical change which happened at the authorized dealer. Therefore, I should not pay for it. It is a local dealer who changed the electricals and he should be attributed to loss and damage. This is basically the analogy of what there is an argument about right now, that if LDCs, if least developed countries have to be paid compensation via a fund in which everybody contributes, the compensation should only be for climate change related events. If the state is not taking care of its water resources, and then it argues that this drought is because of irrigation, because there was no irrigation, then it was your not good water management. So there is a difference, and that is what the argument is. There is a difference between local events and regional events, and what we mean by events here are climatic or weather events. And in this there is also one more variation. This could be independent of climate change, and there can be also local and regional events which can be attributed to climate change. So for example, a man-made drought because of bad water management falls under this category. It is independent of climate change. Then you have a drought which happened because of the impact of climate change on the region and the failure of the rainfall itself. Then you should be compensated. But as you know, not everything is black and white. There's also a gray here, which is that it can be both. It can be both. It can be a climate change based understanding where, for example, El Nino happened. but El Nino is common when it comes to the Indian subcontinent or this Pacific sector itself. But the frequency of El Nino has increased, or the duration of El Nino has increased because of climate change. And at the same point of time, let's take, for example, Bangalore. Bangalore, the water crisis is both climate change based rains being delayed, the rain pattern being changed, but also it is a failure of the government of Karnataka to have solutions and have the what we call as safeguards or mitigation plan for something like this. So the fact that the whole concept is based on getting the water from Kaveri is too much reliance on one source. So therefore it is both anthropogenic and climatic region. So it can be both. It can be both reasons. And this is where a lot of conversation is there. And this article is basically trying to point out that have the attribution technologies and models matured enough at the same point of time, are they reliable enough that I can say that there is an attribution of a local weather event with climate change? And the argument which the article is making as of right now, and it's a very big no, is no. That as of right now, correlation between local weather events or weather local level, one second, local weather events and climate change is not reliable enough. Is not reliable enough. Is not reliable enough, which is there is no realistic, I want to write realistic here, there is no realistic, reliable concept wherein, and the word which has been exactly used is that individual weather events could not be attributed to climate change. Now for a UPSC aspirant, this is in itself a very significant argument. But there is one more thing which needs to be understood. Why? The IPCC is very simply saying that correlation between local weather events and climate change, they cannot be attributed with full reliability, and therefore who is responsible for them? Who is responsible for them? And the reason why is equally important for us, and let's try to understand why. The reason is firstly how these models work. The model which is used is, for example, I have data for 2023 for temperature, and the example which it takes is heat waves. Now what the model does is it takes the data for every month, for example January to December, and brings in that, for example, hypothetically the mean temperature within these heat waves was 48 degrees Celsius. Too high, let's make it 46 before some of you lose your mind over it. So 46 degrees Celsius. Now what will be attributed is that this is the real data. Now what the model will do is it will create a hypothetical model in which if by 2023, for example, 4 billion tons of carbon was emitted into the atmosphere, and that has created the context for 46 degrees Celsius. In the hypothetical model, it will say that no carbon was added into the atmosphere after the industrial phase at this scale. Maybe only 1 or 2 billion CO2 was added to the atmosphere. Now it will create a model in which it will check what is the temperature which has come through. It's a computer-based weather models. Weather models are generally very, very unreliable. Now, when we talk about temperature, now it comes to the conclusion that again, if 2023, if there was no emission at the same scale or no emission itself, in the hypothetical model, the mean temperature between January to December in the same area would have been 42 degrees Celsius. Now, in this case, you can easily say that this local heat wave was because of climate change. So you can attribute climate change to the local event itself. So this is the concept. This is the real data, that 46 degrees Celsius. This is the hypothetical data. That climate change has been taken into account, that if there was no global warming, then what would have been the temperature? If there is global warming, then what is the temperature? But there's a problem. This is extremely unreliable because this firstly is a hypothetical model. In this case, you have to pay loss and damage fund money to the least developed country. But heat waves are not just caused by atmospheric or weather events. There are multiple factors. For example, you need to take into account, urbanization. You have to take into account deforestation. You have to take into account the local weather, which could be anomalous that month, that year, or generally. Now the problem is, now you see, this creates a mess. The mess is, we have one hypothetical model and then multiple factors which have nothing to do with weather, which is urbanization, deforestation. How do I take into account that what if 4 billion tons was added and no urbanization had happened, no deforestation had happened? Then what was the temperature? Now this is a unending probability based understanding. This is where the argument comes in, that this probability based accountability is problematic, and the IPCC and the UNFCCC have to change their approach, because as of right now, half of the events will get attributed to climate change, half of them will not. Then how do we find a middle ground? And therein the article is extremely silent, that as of right now, there is no other way to get these models generated. There is no way to take 3 to 4 factors together into these models itself, and LDCs need to be compensated for. But India also argues that it should be compensated for climate change based disasters. But therein attribution becomes very important. So this article, before we move on to the smaller ones, talks about two very important things. First is the concept of climate change based extreme weather events. And second, again, this is a small summary I'm giving you, which is that can you attribute every local weather event to climate change? So the argument is, as of right now, all local weather events cannot be attributed to climate change. Therefore, it creates an anomaly. Over and above that, the problem is that the models which we are using are based on probability, are based on hypothetical situations, and that too only one factor. But there are multiple factors which are at play here. So in that context, accountability, responsibility, and climate change based loss and damage, what we call as funding, needs to be more nuanced, and we have to find a solution for this other than what we have as of right now. In these type of questions, it is a problem based question rather than a solution based question, and I hope that you understand what we have tried to argue here. So the first 4 topics, as you can see, were big and quite important for mains. The first one talking about Russia and Beijing relationship phase by phase. The second one talking about the stalemate between Andhra Pradesh and Telangana over the capital, and more than that, Schedule 9 and 10 assets, which are public sector corporations. The third one was the most interesting, which is 17C, the controversy over the election commission. And thereafter, the last one which we've discussed here is climate change based models, attribution and attribution probabilities, and the concept of how do you become accountable for, or how do we account for local events with regards to the same thing. With this, let's look at the two small articles. First one is that our Vice President is in Tehran as of right now, and he's there to pay his condolences on behalf of the Prime Minister and the President of India for the untimely and questionable death of the Iranian President, Raisi. And the question is not that he's there. The question is that Iran is a very important partner for us. Be it Chabahar port, be it an alternative solution to the way Gwadar port was being developed. India-Iranian relationships have generally been good. And Raisi has an important role to play in that form of closeness between Iran and India. And the article generally talks about the basics of he's went there, he's met the ambassador has also paid his condolences. But it has a certain section where it talks about how the Chabahar port agreement and the imports which we were doing of oil from Iran and the generic outlook of Iran as of right now was quite advantageous to India. So what we have to make sure is that the next person or the successor of Raisi needs to be very clearly taken into confidence, and this relationship from this point should not go down. So this basic point is that India is going out of its way to show solidarity with Iran in a way to make sure that our relationship with this country remains the same, and there is a lot of strategic interest which is there with regards to Iran. And therefore, this is going to develop further into something like a better article which talks about India-Iranian relationships. But as of right now, we have to remember Chabahar is a very important port for us in this sector, an alternative to the Suez Canal itself. And for us, making sure that the dynamism with this country remains the same is extremely critical. With this is as I told you, this is a prelims related topic. Again, something which you have to look out for and is not something which is important as of right now. So we'll see if this develops further into something more, what we call as tangible, and as a better article which develops and understands everything in the right context. The last article which I want to discuss is a simple one, because nowadays UPSC and PCS examinations, and UPSC has also become extremely sensitive to prizes and awards. So the German writer Jenny Erpenbeck and the translator Michael Hoffman have on Tuesday received the International Booker Prize for the novel Kairos. And why Kairos is important is it is a story of a young woman in a destructive affair with an older man in East Berlin in 1980s, which is the last phase of the what we call as Cold War politics. And therefore the story is based on an historical context, historical fiction as we call it, and it talks about the dynamism of a relationship when there's an east and a west angle in that regard. So that way, this brings us back to the first article itself, which is Cold War politics. But you should note this, simple, straightforward, note this somewhere, can come in the examination, pieces of examinations for sure. Now, with this, let's look at the mains questions and then we can end the session. The controversy over Form 17C has raised concern over electoral transparency. Discuss. This is a very interesting question. This can come in GS paper 2 and it's a very realistic question. Very good question to check if you are up to date with the current affairs or not. Russia's proximity to China in the current geopolitical context raises concerns. Elucidate. This is not specifically for India, but for the world. Here again, you can use the 5 phases to write a very good answer. This again, GS paper 2. So with this, I would end the session. Thank you so much for being here. I hope this discussion has been comprehensive enough, and I will see you in the next session. Thank you. Take care. Do join us for Conquer Prelims. The PDF for this will be available on the Telegram channel, and you already know that 5 questions related to these topics will also be uploaded to the Telegram channel. So do join our Telegram channel. Link is given in the description box. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.